This is the Tom Anderson Show, broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
So often on this show, we talk about not just partisanship or ideology, but why people don't get along and how can they get along? How can people try to understand, not just with sympathy or empathy, but with never met you, don't know you, haven't walked in your shoes, but let me get a glimpse of your existence, and maybe I have, I dropped my shield, I dropped my wall. And otherwise, we just have a really abundant news show with a bunch of carnage and mayhem and problems, and that's depressing, certainly to me. Well, I came across through one of my beloved former professors, Steve Alfrecht, from the graduate program at University of Alaska, the ICER program. He was my instructor and mentor when I finished that before I went off to law school. He contacted me and he said, "Hey, Tom, I met a real crackerjack. I met someone who is smart and thoughtful and really wants to make a difference." And I said, "In what venue?" And he said, "In the media world. He's over at contracting with Alaska Public Media. His name's Drew Cason and grew up in Anchorage. And he is leading the One Small Step series in Alaska." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, why don't you interview Drew rather than ask me?" And so that's what we're going to do. And Drew joins us. And Drew, you've explained it to me, and we'll get into the layers of it. But welcome to the program. And brother, you're leading this One Small Step. Tell us about it. And then I'll ask a lot of questions because I'm intrigued. And I think people, especially those conservative, might want to be part of it when you have room.
Well, thank you so much for having me on this show, Tom. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed, talking over things with you. One Small Step is an effort to address, I think, what kind of is at least my biggest sort of fear or complaint about our politics today, which is that people are entrenching onto their own side, and it's becoming much more of a us versus them. And I think we're losing the value of the marketplace of ideas. And I think that, both sides have been guilty of it, and it's not any one person's fault or any one institution's. But I think that, we the people can start to make a difference. And it starts by, talking to a stranger with different views than you and learning sort of why those might be valuable and why they're, valuable people who care about the same communities that we do.
It's almost like talk radio, but with the listeners that are driving right now, listening to you, Drew, and me, they would be in the studio, because we don't know many of them, and they're all of a sudden they're magically here, and we're face to face with them. Only they get to respond. It's not you and me talking to everybody without a response. I love the idea. You're not starting a new Genesis here in Alaska, though, are you? It's across the nation, is it not?
Yeah, so it's part of the StoryCorps program, and the StoryCorps program got started with some public radio guy in New York grabbing a couple people off of the subway and asking if they wanted to sort of interview one another and be on the radio. And so it's about an hour-long conversation, and I recruit people and, get everybody set up and get them in the room together. And we've been doing them virtually so far, but I actually just got approval this week that we're going to also be able to start doing a couple of these in person. And then I kind of sit back and let you guys ask each other questions and get to know one another. And, we start off just kind of talking about who you are as people, and then we move into talking about some more political things. And it's not a debate. It's not an effort to persuade or change people's minds or anything like that. I think debate's incredibly important. I debated for University of Alaska Anchorage, who's got a phenomenal program. But I think that, we're not quite there yet at the moment. We need to appreciate that the other person's views have value. And a great way of doing that is just by talking to somebody.
With 7, I believe you've done 7, and at some point you're going to merge into live and in person. Have you, of those 7, you've only recorded those by audio. Have you ever videotaped?
No. So they're there is a video. It's like a Zoom sort of thing. It's the StoryCorps program's own platform. But the video is just sort of for the live participants. And when we're doing them in person, we don't plan on videoing them. We're just recording the audio for radio.
Talking with Drew Cason with One Small Step. Drew, could you tell people real quick, and I'll remind them again next segment because we'll keep you for 2. What's the best place to get information on this? And we'll remind everybody again next segment.
Yeah, you can just go to alaskapublic.org/OSS. And
Perfect.
That has a little overview of the program and a spot where you can sign up and fill out a real short questionnaire that sort of puts you into the pool of people that I draw from to sort of create matches and set up these conversations.
Perfect. And I have that on our Tom Anderson Show Facebook page. Tom Steigelman, you would have fun with this. I would have fun with this. But someone I recommended to Drew is Jonathan Greenberg. I think he would do a good job. And I also think Adam Holtz from Focus on the Family would do a good job. Both conservative, but thoughtful. And I just think that those are 2 fellows that call into the show regularly. When you scrutinize the applicants, and I know one of the reasons you're on the show is because you'd like to get more right of center, because you have a lot of left of center, because they're public media fans, and which I am too, and I'm right of center. But to get those, when you recruit them, what are you finding in terms of concern? Are they worried about debating? Are they worried about who their counterpart is? Are they worried about the environment? Because like I asked that one time when we've spoken several times, and the first time I said, is this a debate or is this just a conversation? And you said, well, it's the latter. But is that an apprehension folks have on the right of center?
It really has been. And I think that really on both sides, the one thing that I'm kind of screening for is that I'm looking to avoid people who are trying to have a fight. And so I call people up and just kind of tell them that straightforward. Hey, I looked over your bio and everything. You seem like a real interesting person. What are you hoping to get out of this? And then I kind of turn to, hey, so I'm just really trying to make sure that we're not having people who are, just trying to debate or poke at the other person.
With an agenda.
Yeah, and everybody said, oh no, like that's really so just about everybody I've talked to has been really excited about for the most part they've got pretty homogenous social circles, politically speaking, and they all view things kind of the same way, and they say all my friends agree about this stuff, but I think there's other points of view out there, and I don't have an easy time getting exposed to them.
When I was a state representative, and I'm a Republican, and I was, of course, endorsed by my party and endorsed by a lot of the Republican advocacies that you would think were typical of such, I befriended Beth Kurtula, Les Guerra, Ethan Berkowitz, to a lesser degree David Guttenberg in Fairbanks, and Eric Croft in Anchorage, and a few others, Hollis French. And so we would work together, and guess what? We would go out and have a beer. Or one of us liked bacon, one of us liked ham, one liked scrambled eggs, one liked over easy. We all drove cars and liked our homes and talked about travel or hiking or what games we played with our families, meaning we weren't that far apart. And that's a microcosm somewhat similar to One Small Step in that you can meet and talk, and if you really drop your guard down, I think you can see perspective, and that opens your mind up, and it might not change your opinion. Let's say on the death penalty. I'm not a fan of the death penalty, and you would think I would be as a Republican, but I could talk to someone who is, and maybe they say I had a family who was a victim, and I could see how you could at least relate, Drew, or understand without changing your mind. And is that
I
one?
hope it doesn't change your mind.
Sure.
It's a bad thing if we all view things the same way. We're not trying to get the right answers. We're trying to have a robust, set of perspectives. I think that conservatives tend to understand the costs of regulation a lot better than liberals. But I think that, frankly, liberals tend to understand the need for regulation a lot better than conservatives. And so if you leave either one just to sort of make all decisions, I think it's going to go poorly. That you need people who think that, the government should get involved. You need people who understand what that costs.
Yeah, that's so true. We're talking with Drew Cason, StoryCorps, one small step. Alaska Public Media is now working with StoryCorps nationally. He's already done 7. Maybe you could be 8th or 9th or 10th. We'll talk more with him when we come back right here on the Tom Anderson Show.
This is the Tom Anderson Show, broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
We are back talking about taking one small step, my friends. Alaska Public Media and StoryCorps teaming up. Drew Cason leading the charge in the state of Alaska. He's already performed 7, I guess you could say, recordings. I don't know if you perform a recording or make a recording, but
I've been calling them conversations.
Yeah, I was about to say, but you read my mind. Recording conversations, and would you call it moderating, or would you say you're just an observer, or both?
Yeah, I've been calling it facilitation, but I'm used to, when I do facilitation, being a lot more active. I set it up, and then I feed a few questions, and then I encourage everybody to ignore me and do their own thing, and sort of ask the other person about what they're interested in after they get to know them a little bit.
Well, so now let's spice this up a bit, because we're talking with Drew. It's a morning show. People like sizzle. It's Friday. They're thinking about what they're going to do for the weekend. What would spark interest to the folks listening to want to do this? Because I think so far it's not milquetoast. I think it's engaging. But why don't we go down memory lane of the 7? You don't have to get into names. If you want, you can get into some of the details, though, to intrigue the folks. And maybe after the show, you're going to get a call or an email, and someone's interested right of center, preferably. And I think that's the majority of the folks listening to this show and most talk radio, hence you reaching out to us. But what was something that was intriguing to you, eyebrow raising, maybe enlightening, where you said, hey, this, or encouraging, of those 7 that you facilitated?
Well, I've got 2 answers to that. And one, I'm going to start off kind of in a sideways direction and say that the StoryCorps program is pretty cool. And I think that a lot more liberals are familiar with it than conservatives. Frankly, I hadn't really heard of it until I, applied to work for this program. But it's the largest collection of human voices in the world. They've been plugging these things into the National Archive at the Library of Congress, and so you can be part of sort of human history in a pretty interesting way. And then on a more sort of personal level, I'm not an overly sentimental or emotional person, and in one of these conversations, I teared up. There was a younger fellow from the Valley who's a state trooper, and his name was Edwin, and an older fellow who's an archaeologist from Anchorage. And they had, I didn't know that they were going to have much in common, but it turned out that the most influential person in Morgan's life was his grandfather, and his name was Edwin. And Morgan just sort of sharing about that was really sort of powerful. And so I think that it's just it's a chance to go from kind of 0 to 60 and get into some sometimes kind of heavy stuff with somebody. And if that seems, I think that that's kind of exciting. You spend an hour and a half total, including all of my spiel at the beginning and end, and I think you can have a pretty powerful conversation where you hopefully meet somebody who you become real friends with. And I think that having friends who, push you and have a different perspective on things, that they're some of the most valuable friends you can have.
Here are some hiccups I could foresee, and I wonder if you could respond. One would be that you get a gifted speaker like yourself, or like a Steve Alfrecht, the professor through which you and I met. And Steve is a genius. He's brilliant, and I wouldn't want to debate him. I think I could debate him with my own points, but he's formidable, meaning he's intelligent, but I think that he would listen, and I think that he would be courteous. So he's debatable by anyone because he's not mean-spirited, even though he's so brilliant. That said, what if he was teamed up with someone that didn't have a gift of speak or oration or cognitive thinking, rational-based thinking? Maybe they weren't good at that. Would you have already vetted them? Or because I know Steve did it. And the other concern I would have is two people meet and they agree on everything. Or there's some story exchanges, but they agree. Do you run into any of those, or will you?
Yep, I've run into both of those, and both of them has happened kind of one time. And they're the two times where I've sort of injected myself into the conversation. And as you pointed out, I'm a pretty experienced speaker myself. And so there was one time where I felt like one of the parties was having a hard time expressing herself, and the other party was just seemed to be kind of doing a better job and maybe getting a bit frustrated and so I just sort of stepped in and I rephrased a couple of the things that the other person was saying and tried to kind of level the playing field, because this isn't a debate. And so I think Steve does a great job, and, he doesn't need to, you're not competing. You just need to be able to say stuff that he can understand. And he's a smart guy. He can understand, what you're saying and where you're going with things. And so the goal is you just have to speak well enough to be understood. And I think that's something that just about everybody can do.
And then what about whenever they come together and they both agree, where it's kind of like, okay, this is interesting, but we're two peas in a pod?
Well, as I mentioned once before, I was on the debate team, and I'm really comfortable playing, devil's advocate, and I know quite a bit about, a variety of local policy things. And so if people get too comfortable and are either reluctant to or are struggling to find things they disagree on, I can jump in and, throw a couple of scenarios or particular topics that I think they will come down differently on. And ask them, how they think that we should respond to those things as a community or as a state.
It makes sense. That's where I believe you are a critical component to this. And it goes without saying, because you're the facilitator. But I mean, there can be a facilitator that sits back as a sentinel but idly, or there can be a facilitator that engages and scrutinizes what's being said and slightly prods or pushes, or, I say this in a physicality way, putting a hand around somebody and kind of guiding them back. You're doing that verbally and with content and issues, and I like it. And so for those listening, here's the deal. The reason I invited Drew on, one, I think he's a bright young man, and I'm very proud of him for doing this. I like this program. Do I want to do it? No, because I do it on radio every morning. I would do it if he asked, but I think it's better to get those of you listening and those of you that are right of center, whether it be right of center because of patriotic ideals or faith-based ideals or philosophical ideas tied to finance and taxation and regulation and big government versus less, to have you engaged and Drew pairs you up with somebody on the left, I think would be fascinating. And I would love to listen to those. So for those of you that are interested, get a hold of Drew. Go to Facebook. Drew, what's the easiest way to get a hold of you? I put it on our Facebook page, but so people know. And I'll put it in the podcast link and all that. But if someone's driving and they're like, hey, Anderson, Drew, I'll memorize it, what's the best way?
You can shoot me an email at dcason@alaskapublic.org. That's like Drew Cason, dcason@alaskapublic.org. Or go to the website and just fill out the form to, apply to be in a conversation. And that's alaskapublic.org/OSS, like Perfect. One small step.
Yep. And Cason, 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 Drew, D, starts with a D. Now, the other question is, if someone comes and they have an agenda, let's say they want to talk about one issue or another or get into religious, do you push them away from that to say, hey, let's talk about general things? How does it start? Because someone just texted me and said, how does the conversation start? What does Drew say?
You start off by, you fill out a little bio when you apply, and so you read each other's bios, and then I ask you a couple of sort of non-political questions just about yourself. Or you ask each other. I put them I sort of set them up, and then you interview each other with them. And so you start off, who's the most influential person in your life, and what did they teach you? And you sort of go from questions like that. and then gets into describe your personal politics, and then, ask questions about, is there something you disagree with about the other person's politics,
This is
but still
great.
sort of respect.
I love it, man. And one last question, because we got to let you go. And I'd love to invite you back to hear more. Maybe we get an update next summer or in the spring. But very last question, very important one. People have been writing me during your interview asking, where do we listen to these? When will they become public?
So December 9th at 1 p.m., we're going to do a live show, and we're going to have at least one of the pairs of participants on to do that with us, and we'll be sharing clips from them. So that's the sort of big time to listen to these other conversations in Anchorage or Alaska. But if you participate in one, you don't have to, you're not going on the radio live.
Okay, and that it's recorded
until afterwards.
Drew
It's recorded,
Cason,
and you can choose not to release it if you don't want.
You are awesome. Drew Cason, StoryCorps, One Small Step. Go to our Facebook page or go to Alaska Public Media to sign up. Do it before Christmas, and maybe we can hear you too. Drew, thanks for calling in.